night, when Raven returned home, he had no idea that he was about to stumble upon a scene so gruesome and shocking that it would change the course of his life forever. The moment he stepped through the door, the familiar comfort of his home vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. On the cold floor lay Janet's lifeless body. At first, Raven's mind struggled to make sense of it. His first thought was that she had been shot, perhaps a break-in gone terribly wrong. But as paramedics arrived, the grim truth became clear. This was no random act of violence. It was something far more sinister, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. This documentary will focus on Janet Abaroa was born on June 19, 1979, in a quiet and picturesque small town in Virginia. She was the seventh of 10 children in a large and close-knit family that placed deep importance on faith, values, and togetherness. From childhood, Janet had an innate love for children, often taking on the role of caretaker for her younger siblings. She harbored dreams of one day having a big family of her own, where she could provide the same warmth and love that she had experienced in her upbringing. Alongside her nurturing nature, Janet was also highly disciplined and excelled academically. Schoolwork came easily to her, and she managed to balance her studies with an active participation in sports. As she progressed to high school and later to college, she continued to pursue her passion for sports, playing for local teams and eventually joining the women's soccer team at the University of Southern Virginia. It was during one of her college matches in 1998 that Janet met Raven Abaroa, a talented soccer player who played for the Southern Virginia University men's soccer team. The two were immediately drawn to each other, and what started as a casual friendship soon blossomed into a deep and passionate romance. Their relationship flourished for 2 years, and in that time, they grew inseparable. Finally, Raven, despite being a year younger than Janet, proposed to her, declaring his unwavering love and commitment. She happily accepted, and in August 2000, they were married in the Sacred Mormon Temple in Washington, D.C. A significant and deeply meaningful event for both of them and their families. Following their wedding, the couple eagerly embarked on their new journey together, setting their sights on building a stable and happy life. The first major step they took was seeking employment to ensure financial independence. They secured jobs as salespeople at a sporting goods store, which required them to relocate to Durham, North Carolina. Upon arrival, they rented a modest house in the suburbs, hoping to establish a solid foundation for their future. To the outside world, Janet and Raven appeared to be the picture-perfect couple, young, ambitious, and deeply in love. Friends, neighbors, and even colleagues admired their relationship and often spoke of how they complemented each other. However, beneath the surface, cracks began to form in their seemingly ideal marriage. Not long after settling into their new life, Janet confided in close family members and friends that Raven was not the devoted husband he appeared to be. She discovered that he was unfaithful, engaging in extramarital affairs with multiple women. The betrayals were painful and humiliating, shattering her trust in him. On one occasion, he even left home for several days without any explanation, only to return as if nothing had happened. Amidst this turmoil, Janet discovered she was pregnant, a revelation that brought both joy and anxiety. While she had always dreamed of becoming a mother, the circumstances surrounding her marriage left her feeling conflicted and uncertain about the future. She feared raising a child alone, but was equally troubled by the prospect of staying with a man who continually betrayed her trust. During this challenging time, Janet found solace in the friendships she built within her neighborhood. She grew close to several women who became a support system for her, offering advice, encouragement, and companionship. These friends even confronted Raven, urging him to change his ways and remain faithful to his pregnant wife. Whether out of guilt or genuine intention, Raven promised to mend his ways and become a devoted husband and father. Janet, hoping for the best, allowed herself to believe that things would improve, especially with the impending arrival of their baby. On October 17, 2004, Janet gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, whom they named Caden. The moment she held her son in her arms, everything else faded into the background. Her primary focus became providing him with the best life possible. She devoted herself entirely to motherhood, showering Caden with love and care, determined to give him a stable upbringing. However, the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by the financial struggles the family faced. With Janet no longer working, their household depended solely on Raven's income from his job as a salesman, which was barely enough to cover their expenses. They quickly fell behind on rent, prompting their landlord to offer them a 3-month grace period out of sympathy for their situation. Despite this temporary relief, their financial troubles only worsened. In December 2004, just 2 months after Caden's birth, the situation took a drastic turn. During this period, their son Caden was merely 2 months old when tragedy struck once more. The child's father, Raven Abaroa, found himself in serious legal trouble. He was arrested for theft after being caught stealing merchandise from the very sporting goods store where he and his wife had been employed. Investigators discovered that he had stolen several high-end tracksuits and resold them online for quick cash. The total amount of damages resulting from his actions exceeded $10,000, leading to swift legal consequences. Unsurprisingly, he was immediately terminated from his position, and in the wake of this disgraceful scandal, Janet, unable to withstand the shame and humiliation of her husband's actions, also resigned from her job. Though the charges against him could have resulted in jail time, Raven managed to evade incarceration. Instead, he was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution to the sporting goods store. This left both parents unemployed, financially destitute, and struggling to provide for their newborn child. With a criminal record now attached to his name, Raven found it nearly impossible to secure stable employment. To make ends meet, the couple resorted to part-time jobs and relied heavily on the support of family and friends who offered financial and emotional assistance. Despite the mounting stress and hardship, the young family fought to stay afloat. But their struggles would soon take a much darker and more sinister turn. On the evening of April 26, 2005, Janet picked up Caden from daycare as she did every day. She and her infant son returned home, where she began preparing dinner, settling into the routine of motherhood. Later that evening, Raven arrived home, sat down for dinner with his wife, and, after spending time with his family, announced that he was heading to Morrisville to participate in an indoor soccer game. At the time, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, upon returning home that night, Raven stumbled upon a gruesome and shocking scene that would alter the course of his life forever. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a nightmarish crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and floor, creating a horrifying tableau of violence. Janet's lifeless body lay sprawled in an unnatural position on the floor, a dark pool of blood surrounding her. Their infant son, Caden, lay unharmed in his crib, wailing helplessly in distress. Overcome with shock and horror, Raven frantically dialed 911. His voice panicked as he reported his wife's murder. He told the emergency operator that he had just returned home to find Janet covered in blood, seemingly attacked by an unknown assailant.
911, where is your emergency? I'm dead! You shot me, shot!
Initially, he speculated that she had been shot, but when paramedics arrived, it became evident that she had been stabbed multiple times. The crime was brutal, precise, and deeply disturbing. Janet, a young mother with her whole life ahead of her, had died instantly from the fatal wounds inflicted upon her. Law enforcement officers were shaken by the sheer savagery of the crime. The immediate question that loomed over the investigation was, who could commit such a heinous act against a woman who had devoted her life to her family? Forensic experts meticulously combed through the crime scene, collecting critical evidence that might lead to the perpetrator. The victim's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy was performed to determine the exact cause of death. The autopsy report revealed that Janet had sustained 3 deep stab wounds. One was found on her left arm, which forensic experts identified as a defensive wound, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. The second wound was located in her chest, a lethal strike that contributed to her rapid demise. However, it was the third wound that sealed her fate. A deep stab wound to the neck severed a major artery, causing Janet to lose blood at an alarming rate. Within seconds, she had likely fallen unconscious, and within minutes, her life had ended. Adding to the tragedy, an autopsy confirmed that Janet was pregnant at the time of the murder. The loss of both mother and unborn child sent shockwaves through the community, amplifying the urgency of the investigation. Despite the calculated precision of the attack, forensic experts struggled to determine the exact sequence of the fatal blows. The body exhibited early signs of decomposition, but the low temperature inside the home had likely slowed the process, making it difficult to pinpoint the precise time of death. While forensic specialists worked to piece together the puzzle through physical evidence, detectives turned their attention to potential witnesses who might have seen or heard anything unusual that evening. Almost immediately, their focus shifted to the person who would naturally be considered a suspect, the husband of the deceased, Raven Abaroa. Given the nature of the crime and the history of turmoil in their marriage, he became a person of significant interest in the case. Raven was called in for questioning multiple times, and based on his statements, investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of events leading up to Janet's tragic death. According to his account, he had returned home around 8 p.m. that evening before leaving shortly after to attend his soccer game in Morrisville. He claimed that he did not return home until approximately 10:40 p.m. Upon entering the house, he allegedly called out to his wife, but when she did not respond, he proceeded upstairs. It was there, he insisted, that he discovered her lifeless body. Raven told detectives that Janet sometimes knelt in an unusual posture to relieve leg cramps. Janet was found kneeling with her head pressed against the floor, motionless and unresponsive. At first, Raven was unsure of what he was witnessing, but when he turned on the lights, he was confronted with a horrifying scene. In a state of panic, he quickly turned his wife onto her side and realized with a sinking feeling that she was already dead. Forensic experts later explained that the positioning of her body could have allowed blood to flow steadily from the deep stab wounds, particularly the severed artery, until the thickening process naturally slowed the bleeding. This could have continued for several hours, suggesting that Janet had been deceased for some time before Raven's arrival. However, given the catastrophic nature of her injuries, forensic specialists could not rule out the possibility that she had been killed just moments before he entered the home. The uncertainty surrounding the exact time of death only added to the growing list of questions detectives needed to answer. When questioned about possible suspects who might have wanted to harm Janet, Raven provided an unexpected and perplexing theory. He suggested that the recent financial difficulties the couple had been facing had taken a severe emotional toll on his wife. In his opinion, Janet had succumbed to the overwhelming burden of their economic struggles and had taken her own life. According to him, she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her death, often blaming herself for their predicament and expressing distress over their financial instability. However, this claim was immediately met with skepticism and outright rejection by Janet's family and close friends. They insisted that Raven's statements were entirely false, fabricated to mislead investigators. Those closest to Janet knew firsthand how she truly felt. She had confided in them regularly, sharing her frustrations and struggles, but never once had she voiced any inclination toward self-harm. Furthermore, forensic evidence made it abundantly clear that she could not have inflicted these wounds on herself. Compounding the suspicions, evidence at the crime scene suggested that someone else had been in the house at the time of the murder. A bloody shoe print was discovered near Janet's body, along with a fingerprint that did not immediately match hers or Raven's. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were all intact, leading detectives to one unsettling conclusion. The victim either knew the perpetrator and willingly allowed them into the home, or the attacker already had access to the residence. Either way, this pointed to someone familiar with Janet, someone close enough to enter without resistance. Despite the brutal nature of the attack, there were very few signs of a struggle. The only indication of self-defense was a stab wound to Janet's arm, suggesting she had attempted to shield herself from the fatal blows. This supported the theory that the attack was swift and unexpected. Adding to the mystery, Raven claimed that his wife had already been asleep when he left for his soccer game. If true, this meant that the murderer had likely struck after she had gone to bed, making it even more likely that the killer was someone she trusted enough not to wake up for. Another strange detail stood out to investigators. The only missing items from the house were Raven's laptop and 2 kitchen knives. One of these knives was almost certainly the murder weapon, but the absence of the laptop suggested the possibility that someone wanted to destroy evidence rather than steal valuables. Intriguingly, the perpetrator had ignored other valuable items in the home, including Janet's wedding rings and other jewelry, indicating that robbery was not the motive. At that stage, detectives lacked concrete evidence to arrest anyone, including Raven, so he was temporarily released. However, law enforcement officials had already begun to suspect that he was not as innocent as he claimed. Investigators decided to monitor his actions closely, believing that he might eventually expose himself through his behavior. What followed only deepened their suspicions. Just one day after Janet's murder, Raven packed his belongings, took his infant son Caden, and abruptly left for Utah. On the surface, this move might have been seen as natural. After all, many widowers find it unbearable to remain in the home where their loved one was violently taken from them. Furthermore, given that Raven's family resided in Utah, it made sense that he would seek their support in such a difficult time. However, his behavior upon arriving in Utah raised red flags for both his own relatives and the friends of the deceased. Instead of displaying the grief and devastation one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife in such a horrific manner, Raven appeared indifferent and detached. Witnesses noted that he showed little concern for finding Janet's killer or seeking justice for her murder. Instead, he completely distanced himself from the case, as if he wanted to forget it had ever happened. He ignored calls from investigators and refused to cooperate with authorities. Investigators had stumbled upon a potential motive when they discovered that shortly before the murder, Raven had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Janet's life. The amount? A staggering $600,000. This revelation raised immediate red flags. Given the couple's well-documented financial struggles, it was deeply suspicious that Raven, who often complained about their lack of funds, had somehow managed to consistently pay the policy premiums. Even more alarming was the timeline. Evidence showed that Raven had filed a claim with the insurance company almost immediately after Janet's murder, before her body had even been laid to rest. This brazen move only deepened law enforcement's suspicions. The entire situation reeked of foul play, but it was not yet enough to prove his direct involvement in Janet's death. As detectives delved deeper into Raven's past, they unearthed a web of lies that had surrounded his relationship with Janet from the very beginning. He had presented himself to her as a devout Mormon, claiming to have embarked on a missionary trip to Peru. But it was all fabricated. The stories he had spun to create an illusion of virtue unraveled one by one. Though these deceptions did not directly tie him to the crime, they painted a picture of a man skilled in manipulation and deceit, someone who could craft a compelling narrative to serve his own interests. After Janet's death, Raven relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he maintained a low profile. He quietly collected his insurance payout and focused on raising his son, all while seemingly moving forward with his life. But his fresh start did not mean he had abandoned his ways. It was here that he met a woman named Vanessa Pond, a kindergarten teacher who quickly became enamored with the charming single father. Their relationship progressed rapidly, facilitated by the fact that Raven had enrolled son in the school where Vanessa worked. Their frequent encounters turned into something deeper, and before long, they were inseparable. Like Janet before her, Vanessa was drawn to Raven's persistent, charismatic nature. She had spent years raising her child alone and had longed for a partner who would not only love her, but also provide a stable family unit. Raven fit the mold perfectly, at least on the surface. It wasn't long before he began weaving another intricate web of deception. When discussing his past, he told Vanessa that his late wife had tragically died in a car accident. Unbeknownst to Raven, Janet's family was still watching him closely. They had never stopped suspecting him and had made it their mission to track his movements. When they discovered his new relationship, they became even more determined to expose him. To their shock, they found that Raven was continuing his pattern of deception, lying to everyone around him about Janet's fate. He had constructed a false reality in which he was the grieving widower of a tragic accident, rather than the prime suspect in a vicious murder. For a while, Vanessa remained blissfully unaware of the truth. She trusted Raven completely and had no reason to question his version of events. But curiosity has a way of creeping in. Eventually, she began to dig into his past. It didn't take long for her to uncover the chilling truth. Janet had been the victim of a brutal stabbing, and her murder was still an open investigation. Shocked, she confronted Raven. His response was as manipulative as ever. He claimed that he had been unfairly targeted by the police and the public, who were obsessed with pinning the crime on him. He insisted that Janet had been killed during a robbery, and that he had been falsely accused simply because he was her husband. Amazingly, Vanessa believed him. He had an uncanny ability to distort reality, and once again, his lies worked. Despite the evidence staring her in the face, she accepted his explanation, convinced that he was being unfairly persecuted. But Janet's family was determined to intervene. They reached out to Vanessa, warning her that she could be in grave danger. They urged her to reconsider her involvement with Raven, emphasizing the unsettling parallels between her relationship with him and what Janet had endured. Yet Vanessa was too deeply entwined in Raven's web to see the truth. She dismissed the concerns, trusting the man who had charmed his way into her life. Her unwavering faith in him led to their marriage after 3 years of dating. To the outside world, it appeared that Raven had finally moved on and built a new life. But beneath the surface, history was repeating itself. The cracks in their relationship began to show almost immediately. What had once seemed like a fairy tale romance quickly unraveled into a nightmare. Vanessa soon witnessed the same troubling behavior that Janet had endured. Raven's unpredictable mood swings, his bursts of rage, and his controlling tendencies. He began losing control, becoming volatile and aggressive. As the marriage progressed, his behavior worsened. He raised his hand to her in anger, issuing threats that left her terrified for her safety. Fear took root in Vanessa's heart. She had believed she had found love, only to realize she had walked into a dangerous situation. The abuse escalated, and she knew she had to escape. Their marriage, which had once held so much promise, crumbled in just 4 months. She made the difficult decision to leave him, fearing that if she stayed, she might meet the same fate as Janet. Since the pressure from the detectives did not stop, Raven decided to talk to the press. The man publicly expressed hope that the police would eventually solve the case, identify the true perpetrator, and finally stop treating him as a suspect. As media coverage around Raven intensified and more details of Janet's murder emerged, she found herself tormented by an unbearable question. Could her ex-husband have actually murdered his first wife? Vanessa decided to come forward and speak with the media. She confirmed what many had already suspected. Raven Abaroa had always been unstable, manipulative, and prone to fits of aggression. The worst incident, according to Vanessa, occurred on Christmas Eve in 2008. During one of their frequent heated arguments, an argument that he had provoked, Raven suddenly locked her inside the bathroom. Through the locked door, he shouted threats at her, saying he wanted to hit her, that he despised her, and that he wouldn't care if she died. Vanessa's fear was justified. The new detectives working the case felt similarly. They enthusiastically resumed the investigation, determined to piece together the sequence of events that had led to Janet's tragic and brutal death. Everything they examined pointed to one conclusion: Raven was the killer. The primary challenge, however, remained his alibi. Investigators revisited the 911 call he had made upon discovering his wife's body, scrutinizing every word. A major red flag stood out. During the call, Raven claimed that Janet had been shot. This was a glaring mistake. The wounds on her body were clearly stab wounds, and even in a state of shock, it seemed improbable that he wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two. While this wasn't definitive proof of guilt, detectives believed it was an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. Perhaps he thought that by falsely reporting gunshot wounds, he could create confusion and delay forensic analysis. The police weren't buying his story. They decided to pressure him further. They reached out, asking for a follow-up phone interview. During this call, Raven repeated the same version of events he had told before. However, just like in previous interrogations, he was oddly vague on key details. He struggled to recall significant moments from the night of the murder, an unusual lapse in memory for someone who had gone through such a traumatic event. At one point, he even mocked the police, asserting that they had failed to locate one of the missing knives from his home, which he had later found himself while moving. But the detectives weren't fooled. They knew that their forensic team had conducted an exhaustive examination of the crime scene. If they hadn't found a missing knife, it was because it simply wasn't there. Raven's story reeked of manipulation. Over the years, as the case continued to stall, the new team of investigators struggled to reconstruct the original crime scene and timeline with absolute certainty. As part of their renewed efforts, detectives began reaching out to Raven's past girlfriends, hoping to uncover more about his character. Their findings were both disturbing and eerily consistent. Every woman they spoke to painted a chillingly similar picture. Raven was controlling, volatile, and prone to violent outbursts. Many of them admitted that his aggressive tendencies had been the primary reason for the end of their relationships. These testimonies further strengthened the case against him. Another peculiar detail emerged, something seemingly small but potentially significant. Before leaving for his soccer game on the night of the murder, Raven had locked his dog inside the garage. This was highly unusual. He had never done this before. When asked about it, he provided no logical explanation. However, detectives suspected they knew the real reason. A dog is naturally protective of its home and owner. If an intruder had attacked Janet, the dog would have likely reacted, barking loudly and possibly even attacking the perpetrator. Investigators also uncovered a suspicious action taken by the suspect the day before the crime. Raven had transferred data from his laptop onto another storage device. This raised serious red flags. It seemed more like an act of deliberate preparation rather than a coincidence, particularly since the laptop was reported stolen soon after. This discovery added to the mounting pile of circumstantial evidence. Based on these developments, on February 1, 2010, Raven Abaroa was officially arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. He was extradited to North Carolina to face trial, but despite the growing suspicion against him, the case remained largely circumstantial. Investigators knew they needed more concrete evidence to secure a conviction, so they meticulously continued combing through crime scene photos and forensic reports. During this renewed scrutiny, a detective made an important observation. In one of the crime scene photographs, an empty contact lens case was visible on the bedside table. This seemingly insignificant detail took on great importance when Janet's parents insisted that their daughter never slept with her lenses in. She always removed them before going to bed. However, Raven had repeatedly told investigators that when he left for his soccer game that night, Janet was already in bed, asleep with their baby. This discrepancy raised a crucial question. Could Janet have been murdered before ever going to bed, contradicting Raven's timeline entirely? Unfortunately, during the initial autopsy, the medical examiner had not checked whether Janet had been wearing her contact lenses at the time of her death. Determined to find the truth, Janet's grieving family supported an exhumation of her body to confirm this theory. In July 2010, forensic experts exhumed Janet's remains. Despite decomposition, they found what appeared to be the remnants of contact lenses on her eyes. Though the material had dried out and deformed over time, advanced forensic techniques allowed them to confirm that the lenses had indeed been in place when she died. To ensure that this discovery would hold weight in court, experts conducted a large-scale experiment that took nearly a year. Using pig's eyes, similar in structure to human eyes, scientists inserted contact lenses and subjected them to an embalming process identical to what human bodies go through before burial. The results were conclusive. Contact lenses remained intact and detectable even after extended decomposition. This experiment definitively proved that Janet had been murdered while still wearing her lenses, reinforcing the theory that she was attacked before bedtime. Raven's claim that she had been asleep when he left was now irrefutably proven false, further implicating him in the crime. By the time the trial began in 2013, the case had garnered widespread public attention. The prosecution laid out a compelling case against Raven, making it clear that they firmly believed he was guilty of murdering his wife. However, the biggest challenge for the prosecution remained the lack of direct evidence. Everything pointed to Raven, but there was no smoking gun. The defense capitalized on this fact, arguing that all the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no definitive proof linking Raven to the murder. During the investigation, yet another damning piece of evidence emerged, one that further exposed Raven's deception. Throughout the police interrogations, he had repeatedly claimed that he found his wife already dead upon his arrival home. But investigators learned that he had made a shocking confession during a conversation at a local church. In that confession, Raven admitted that Janet had still been alive when he found her. He claimed that she had even attempted to speak before collapsing and dying in front of him. As the case unfolded, detectives explored another potential motive. Was Janet planning to leave her husband? Investigators discovered that in the weeks leading up to her death, Janet had been in contact with an old boyfriend, a man named Scott. Some speculated that she might have been rekindling a romantic relationship, but upon examining their exchanges, detectives found no clear evidence of an affair. Instead, their messages suggested that she had only just begun reaching out, possibly seeking emotional support rather than intimacy. Another crucial argument presented by the prosecution was centered around a possible motive for the crime: Janet's unplanned pregnancy. According to investigators, Janet had only shared this news with a select few, including several of her sisters. Those close to her confirmed that she was elated at the thought of becoming a mother again, but at the same time, she harbored doubts about Raven's ability to be a responsible father. Given their already dire financial situation, prosecutors suggested that the pregnancy might have been the breaking point for Raven. The possibility of another child could have exacerbated their economic struggles, fueling tensions within the marriage. This, the prosecution argued, might have pushed Raven to commit the ultimate crime, eliminating Janet rather than facing the challenges of another child. As new revelations continued to surface, the defense filed a motion to have the trial delayed, arguing that the character portrayals of both the victim and the defendant had not been fully explored. The court granted the motion, rescheduling the next phase of the trial for March 2014. By this time, however, a dramatic turn of events had occurred. Raven Abaroa, likely realizing that the mounting evidence against him was too substantial to fight, agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution. Under the terms of the deal, Raven was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 8 years.